next learning objective is to calculate equivalent units of production for direct materials and conversion costs. Now we are looking at Christie's Crayons cost flows. We will concentrate on the 3 work-in-process inventory accounts, along with finished goods, because that is where the challenge is for accountants in process costing. Naturally, the costs start in raw materials, but I did not have room to show the raw materials account on the slide. Raw materials would be off to the left part of the slide. So costs flow from raw materials to the mixing process or department, where the colors are mixed. In addition to the direct materials costs, direct labor costs accumulate on the debit side of the account, and manufacturing overhead costs also accumulate on the debit side. So in each process or department, the costs get larger and larger as more costs are added to make the crayons. Examples of manufacturing overhead costs for the mixing department could be maintenance costs on the mixing machines and depreciation on the mixing machines. Then the crayons and their costs transfer to the molding department, where the crayons are poured into molds. There, additional costs accumulate. They then move to the packaging department, where the wrapper is placed on the crayon. The wrapper would be direct materials. Other costs that would accumulate on the debit side of the account would be direct labor and additional manufacturing overhead. Then the crayons and their costs move to finished goods when the crayons are completed. And then when sold, the costs are transferred out of finished goods to cost of goods sold. So at the end of the accounting period, there will be some crayons still in the process of being mixed, some being molded, and some being packaged. The cost of these crayons still in process would be the ending balance of each work-in-process inventory account. These would then become the beginning balances at the start of the next accounting period. And naturally that means there were beginning balances for this period, which were the ending balances of the previous accounting period. So the primary accounting objective of process costing for Christie's Crayons is to 1. Determine each department's costs for that accounting period, which includes direct materials, direct labor, and manufacturing overhead. These would appear on the plus side of the work-in-process inventory accounts under the beginning balance. Objective 2. Determine how to divide those costs between crayons transferred out of that department and into the next department. These would be represented as decreases or credits. And 3. Determine the cost of crayons remaining in the department at the end of the accounting period. This would, of course, be the ending balance. For example, if the mixing department had a beginning balance of $1,000 and $9,000 of additional costs were added in the form of direct materials, direct labor, and manufacturing overhead, this means we have $10,000 of costs to account for. Let's say our ending balance was $2,000. So we have $10,000 to account for on the debit side, and we had $2,000 left still in the mixing department at the end of the period. Then that must mean we transferred out or credited $8,000 worth of costs. It's important to understand that the $1,000 of beginning balance and the $9,000 of additional costs added together are called costs to account for. And the ending balance of $2,000 and $8,000 transferred out added together are called costs accounted for. The term equivalent units of production is often used in a process costing system, so we'll describe what they are and how they are calculated. So at the end of each accounting period, we will take the total production costs incurred in each process. Note, we'll use the mixing department's work-in-process inventory account for Christie's Crayons as an example. So the total production costs incurred includes the beginning balance of costs at the beginning of the period. Remember, this figure was the prior accounting period's ending balance and represents the cost of the partially completed crayons at the end of last period, which have become our beginning balance this period. In this example, the beginning balance was $1,000 of partially completed crayons. Then we add the costs that were added during the mixing process, which includes direct materials, direct labor, and manufacturing overhead. In our example, these additional costs were $9,000. Then we have to divide those costs between any units completely finished and transferred to the next account, and any units still in process at the end of the accounting period. In our example, there were unfinished crayons, also known as ending balance, with $2,000 of costs attached to them. For example, if we know we started with $1,000 of costs, which is the beginning balance, added $9,000 of costs, then transferred $8,000 worth of costs out to the process, how much do we have left over in our ending balance? Well, $10,000 of costs to account for, minus $8,000 transferred out, means we have $2,000 in our ending balance. So when we calculate the cost per crayon of the finished crayons transferred out, the $8,000 shown in our example, we have to keep track of those crayons separately from the crayons that are partially completed, the $2,000 ending balance in our example, because the partially completed crayons are not 100% complete. They could be 10% complete, 60% complete, 95% complete, etc. So we can't simply take the $8,000, add it to the $2,000, and then divide by the number of crayons. Instead, we have to use the concepts of equivalent units of production. Equivalent units of production, EUP for short, is used to measure the amount of materials added to or work done on partially completed units and expressed in terms of fully completed units. So here's an example. Let's say your younger brother is helping you and he's carrying buckets of water, but he's not strong enough to carry a full bucket of water. Instead, he carries the bucket half full. Then let's say he carries 6 half buckets of water. How many full buckets is that equivalent to? Well, 6 buckets times 0.5, or a half, is equivalent of 3 full buckets of water. Now let's talk about Christie's crayons. Assume the mixing department has 12,000 crayons halfway finished at the end of the accounting period. That is equivalent of how many crayons completely finished? Well, 12,000 crayons times 0.5 gives us the equivalent of 6,000 crayons being 100% complete. And our second example, in the molding department, there are 8,000 crayons 30% complete. That's the equivalent of how many crayons being fully completed? Well, 8,000 crayons times 0.3 gives us the equivalent of 2,400 crayons being fully completed. So now let's get a bit more in-depth into equivalent units of production. Let's focus on the packaging department's ending balance. Now this part is very important. We are discussing the quantity of crayons in the ending balance. We are not talking about costs yet. So the packaging department has 10,000 crayons still in the packaging department at the end of the accounting period. The textbook will refer to these as units. And because these crayons are still in the packaging department and not in finished goods inventory account, then that means these crayons are not finished, which of course is why they are in a work in process inventory account. So to help us calculate the costs of these crayons for the journal entry, we must first answer this question. 10,000 of these partially completed crayons are the equivalent of how many fully completed crayons? For that, we need more information. So we find out that each crayon has had the wrapper attached to the crayon, but the crayons are not put in the box yet. The end of the accounting period happened before this part of the packaging process could be completed. The crayon wrappers are considered direct materials for the packaging department. And the box is also considered direct materials for the packaging department. So again, the wrappers have been attached, so the cost of the wrappers has to be included in the cost of the crayons so far. But they have not been put in the box yet, so we cannot count the cost of the box in this accounting period. So let's say the cost of the wrappers are 40% of the direct materials cost for the packaging department. So if we take those 10,000 partially completed crayons that have the wrapper attached to them but not the box, we multiply it by the 40% cost of those wrappers in the packaging department, we can say that this is 4,000 equivalent units of production, EUP, for direct materials for the packaging department. These 10,000 crayons, partially completed, is the equivalent of 4,000 fully completed in terms of direct materials. But those equivalent units only apply to the direct materials cost. There are also direct labor and manufacturing overhead costs we have to consider. That's our next topic. So we talked about accounting for direct materials. So now let's turn our attention to direct labor and manufacturing overhead, which, combined, are called conversion costs. Many manufacturing companies that use process costing are highly automated. This means that machines do more of the work than humans. So direct labor is a small part of total manufacturing costs. Christie's Crayons falls into this category. It's not humans that are doing the mixing, molding, and packaging, it's machines. For these manufacturers to make accounting easier, they'll combine direct labor with manufacturing overhead. These are called conversion costs. So conversion costs are simply direct labor plus manufacturing overhead. These are the primary costs in a machine-intensive manufacturing process. From a previous chapter, you may remember this diagram showing that conversion costs are direct labor plus manufacturing overhead. They are called conversion costs because they are the cost to convert raw materials into finished goods. So our biggest takeaway is that conversion costs are direct labor plus manufacturing overhead. So now we're going to find the equivalent units of production for those 10,000 partially completed units, and we'll do it separately for these costs: direct materials and conversion costs. Remember, conversion costs are direct labor plus manufacturing overhead. And as a reminder, equivalent units of production, EUP, is used to measure the amount of materials, in other words, direct materials, added to or work, in other words, conversion costs, done on partially completed units and expressed in terms of fully completed units. We'll start with direct materials. We'll use the same information as before, just so we get some extra practice. The 10,000 partially completed units had 40% of the direct materials cost completed. This was the wrapper on the crayons. So to get the equivalent units of production for direct materials, we multiply 10,000 partially completed crayons by 40% to get 4,000 equivalent units of production, EUP, for direct materials for the packaging department. In other words, these 10,000 crayons partially completed is equivalent of 4,000 fully completed in terms of direct materials. Now let's move on to conversion costs. The crayons were 40% completed in terms of direct materials, but the percentages can be different for conversion costs, which are direct labor and manufacturing overhead. So in terms of conversion costs, it turns out that the crayons are 80% complete. So the equivalent units of production for conversion costs for these 10,000 partially completed crayons is 8,000 equivalent units of production. We calculated that by taking the 10,000 crayons times the 80% completion percentage to get 8,000 equivalent units of production. So notice that the equivalent units of production for these 10,000 crayons are different in terms of direct materials and conversion costs. These 10,000 partially completed crayons are equivalent to 4,000 fully completed crayons in terms of direct materials. And these 10,000 partially completed crayons are equivalent to 8,000 fully completed crayons in terms of conversion costs, which is a combination of direct labor and manufacturing overhead. Well, we've got a good start on calculating the three production costs: direct materials, direct labor, and manufacturing overhead. You'll see the equivalent units of production concept play out in the rest of this chapter, as it's a major part of creating the production cost report, which is our next topic.